Welcome to Sociology class with Professor Mead. Today we're going to talk about culture. This is your Think, Pair, Share discussion questions. If you were to be taking class on campus, the lecture starts with the Think, Pair, Share questions, and everybody's given a few minutes to try to see what answers they know prior to the lecture. Theoretically, you should have read the chapter very casually prior to reading the lecture. So take a moment and pause this when we're done talking about it and try to write down the answers to see what you know, so that at the end of the lecture you can see what information you've gained and how you've moved forward. What is culture? So culture is three things, and you would need to fill those in. What's a social norm? What happens when you break a social norm? Is culture universal? And what is the Sapphire-Whorf hypothesis? The first thing we're going to talk about is culture. So what is culture? We say that culture is shared, learned, and taken for granted, but what does that mean? Culture is a shared experience. Without multiple people, you don't necessarily have a culture. It's the experiences that you develop together that make culture. It's learned, first through your family and primary interactions, and later through friends, and then through the variety of institutions, right? So family, education system, media, the government, policing, those types of things also all teach us about our culture, what's expected and what's not expected, what's allowed and what's not. And then of course, culture's taken for granted. The longer that you live in a society, the more invisible that culture seems to you, which is why when you go to another country, you can see their culture in a variety of different ways. I love going to the grocery store when I visit different countries, because grocery stores to me are the quintessential everyday culture, right? We don't think about how our Albertsons is very culturally American. Not only does it have American foods, but the huge aisles, the 500 different brands of cereal or anything, really, chips, all these different things, the big neon lights, just the size of the store itself, that is all taken for granted culture that we don't necessarily recognize or even see. So I'd like to share a story that's a good example of this. When my son was a little boy, he had a best friend, and either his mom had both of them or I had both of them. It was like we were sharing custody, and they were always together. So one day I take both of the kids to the carniceria, which is a Mexican meat market. And while we're Hispanic and we had been there lots of times, the little boy who was from Texas, from a rural area in Texas, and who had an ethnically very white background, he had never been to a Mexican market. And so I was explaining to the boys, this is, our culture, this is why you see a market where the meat is open air, you can smell it, you can smell the fruits and vegetables, there's different types of foods, there's different types of candies. I offered to let them have that type of candy, pick out a Mexican candy for today, but this is part of our culture. To which my very smart 5-year-old son says to me, "This isn't culture, this is the grocery store." And I think that this is one of the best examples I have of this, because it really shows us how our own culture can become invisible to us, right? If we visit grocery stores in other countries, we can see how different those stores are. Not just the food, but the layout and just the way that people interact, everything about it. But when we've never visited a place like that, we don't realize when we go to our own Vons or Albertsons or Kroger's or wherever you're going, that that is actually part of your culture. Now, what we tend to do is ethnocentrism. We tend to look at someone else's culture through our own cultural lens, ethnocentrism. But if you try to look at someone else's culture through their lens, based on their own terms, we would call that cultural relativism. So some of the basics when you're talking about culture, these are basic terms that you need to know in sociology, and you kind of just need to know anyways, but it's part of our non-material culture. So most of the time when we think about culture, we're thinking about material culture. That's easy. Non-material cultures are the norms, values, and mores of a society, and as well as the language and behavior, the way in which we speak and act. You know, even in American culture, men are allowed to speak more directly. Women are supposed to use a more passive voice. You will get a negative sanction if you don't use a passive voice, meaning, oh, could be, should be, would you mind, that type of thing. Whereas it's more expected and the norm for men to give a direct thing. Grab that, do this. It is like A, B, and C, right? So that's kind of a language manner in which we speak that is a cultural norm for our American society based on sex. Norms are simply rules of behavior or abstract standards or expectations that we expect from somebody. So the easiest example of this is talking about how we can break a norm. We can always see it when we break a norm. So the picture to the right is somebody cutting in line, right? So if you cut in line, you're breaking a norm because we're expecting the norm to be is when you see a line, you get in the back, right? So these are the rules and behaviors that basically if you break, you're considered rude. Jumping into the elevator before other people have the opportunity to get out in American culture is considered rude because the norm is to allow people out first before you get in. Cutting in line is breaking a norm. Standing very close to somebody when you talk to them, like inches away from their face, that is breaking a cultural norm even before COVID issues. These are everyday interactions that you're expected to follow, and they can change from place to place and even change on a micro level from place to place. Think about the different expectations that you have when you're standing in the hall at school versus when you use a restroom at school. What are some of the cultural norms within the restrooms? Within public restrooms, right? What are the rules for behavior that nobody may have told you explicitly, but if you broke one, they'll give you a dirty look, they'll say something to you maybe, or they'll just ignore you, and you kind of learn to follow those rules. Values are more abstract standards of society. So things like you should work hard, you should, be a good person, you should, value your friends and your family. Those types of things are values. Sometimes values can be enacted into law, but they're not always. Norms are almost never enacted into law. So a value would be like, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, right? So if somebody steals a pencil, we're not going to arrest them, but if they steal a car, we would arrest them. So it's that middle way between norms and values, or norms and mores. Mores are more controlled moral and ethical behavior, and these are more often upheld by law. So don't kill, don't murder, don't steal, don't rape, those kinds of things. These are the types of values that if you break these values, not only may we put you in jail, but we may decide to remove you from society entirely. Norms, values, mores are something you should know the terms of. Especially if you move forward in sociology, they're common basic terms within sociology that you should know. And you'll also hear them in the media or within popular culture because you'll hear the term norm or value, and they'll be using it in that same way. Material culture is the easy stuff, right? This is what we think of when we think of culture. Cars, food, clothing, right? And whenever anybody is talking about culture or sharing culture, they basically say, let's have a potluck. You bring the food from your culture and I'll bring the food from my culture, or what I'm wearing, or even the buildings that I have. We can see that as part of our culture, but that's the easier one, right? So there's both material culture and non-material culture. And so the material culture is any object that's created by a society or a group that we start to identify with that group. Another part of culture that's very important is what we call language. So language is both the spoken word, but it's also the combination of symbols that we use either with our hands or symbols that we see within society that convey some type of meaning. So if you think about like a police badge, that's a symbol, but it's part of our language because it conveys very particular meaning. And why? So what language does is it allows us to have a cumulative shared experience. We can share a past, a future, and a perspective. And that means that we can agree on what reality is because we have language. Animals that don't have that type of language cannot have culture because they cannot have a shared past, they cannot have a shared future, and they cannot have a shared perspective. You can't make an appointment with your dog to have coffee in the future because you don't have a shared language. For our culture, because of the way that we speak, it absolutely shapes our thoughts and our perceptions about the world. In our culture, we tend to be very goal-directed or linear thinking, right? And so our language reflects that. When you talk about something like time or a timeline, we think about time in this very linear way. We think about like the timeline that would just be one line with all these dates. And so our past is behind us, and our future is in front of us, our present is here. Now that makes sense for us, but that's not necessarily how time is viewed by every single culture, because not every culture is directional, and that doesn't mean that we will always think of time that way. A good example of looking at time in a different way would be the helical model or the solar system in motion, so a helical visualization of time. I do have it linked in the PowerPoint if you're curious what that means, but it's interesting because it gives you a different perspective of how time would work that's not necessarily linear. And then ideologies. So ideologies are ideas in common. So they are, because of language, the ideas that we can share as a culture, good or bad, are called ideologies. And these are kind of partially an idea and a value that we hold as a group. So it's not so much common sense, but a sense in common, or an idea and value and sense in common. See the difference? So this brings us to Sapphire-Whorf hypothesis. So what's Sapphire-Whorf hypothesis? It is literally the structure of a language that determines your perception of reality. So for example, in our culture, we have two words for jelly and jam. That people see those two things as distinct, right? So one, jelly is from fruit and jellied, and jam is the fruit compost and then also partially jellied or with sugar, right? So we have two words for that, but in some languages there's only one word. So literally those two things are the same thing within those cultures. That happens all of the time with language. Love is also another good example of this. In our culture, we have one word for love, but in some cultures, they have a variety of different words for love, depending on the type of love that you're giving or who you're talking about, right? So there's one word for love for your grandma, one word for love for your partner, one word for love for your pet. Right? In our culture, we say, I love my grandma, I love my spouse, I love my pet, But we obviously know we love them in different ways. We don't love our grandma and our spouse in the same way, right? That seems strange to us. But we use the same word. So we blanket it under the same structure of language, whereas in some cultures they separate those different distinct types of love. But this guides you to the reality. It can expand the way you think, but it can also limit the way that you think. Even though language is absolutely necessary, it shapes our thoughts and ideas. Moving on from language, let's talk about components of culture, specifically components of symbolic culture. So things like symbols, badges, flags, all of those are different ways in which we communicate, gestures, flipping someone off, pointing at them, waving at them, giving them the peace sign. Gestures convey meaning and they're part of our culture. How is that part of our culture? Like, for example, giving somebody the peace sign with your fingerprints forward, right? That's a positive thing. But if you went to Europe and you give somebody the peace sign but with your fingernails forward, that's actually a negative term. It's more akin to flipping somebody off or saying F you, right? So hand gestures change over time and they change based on location because of culture, and so does language, the way that we speak, the way that we interact, right? And a term that you may not know is something called acculturation. So I wanted to show you an example of this because acculturation, while it's not always negative, we think of it as negative. So whenever a symbol, gestures, language, or some type of culture, non-material culture usually, is usurped by a more powerful culture, if it's taken by a culture and they change the meaning, especially if they make it a negative meaning, that's what we would term acculturation. So acculturation can also be turned in a positive way. You can take parts of people's culture and bring them into your own culture and blend them together. So it's not necessarily a negative term, but I want to show you this, right? So this picture on the right with the Native American here, and you see the swastika, it seems weird to us as Americans because when we think of swastikas, we think of Nazi Germans. So this here is obviously after. So prior to the acculturation of the swastika by Germany during the Nazi Revolution, the swastika belonged as a symbol to Native Americans, and it was a symbol of peace. But it was acculturated by Germans into their flags, into their culture, and they actually changed the meaning of that. That's occurring again today, where we see swastikas and American flags hung side by side and being used by people today. And they are essentially acculturating both the swastika and the American flag and changing the meaning. So what's happening by them blending those two symbols together is that they are going to acculturate the American flag and swastikas together. So we're going to pull the meaning from what we understand, Nazi Germany, from a swastika and blend it with our meaning of our American flag if it continues. So it would be acculturated back into our society. And what's being acculturated here is not so much the swastika, but the American flag. Additional components of culture include subcultures and countercultures. So subcultures are the cultures that fall within a culture. So neo-Nazis within America, that's a subculture. Car cultures, that's a subculture. But even within subcultures, there are even what we call subcultures, right? So you can have car culture within America, but then there's even different types of car culture or tattoo culture within those cultures. When we call something a counterculture, it is that the main values of that culture are counter to the dominant values of the dominant culture at the time, right? So a car culture is not a counterculture because cars and our value for cars and our love of vehicles in America is part of our dominant culture. Additional components of culture include things like our folkways, mores, and taboos. Now, these are different terms, but we already know them. Folkways are norms, and from this perspective, mores are more akin to values, but they're also still mores. And then taboos are even a next step after mores. So folkways are norms that they're not going to be strictly enforced. What's a good example of a folkway that's not strictly enforced? Usually if somebody gets into the elevator before you have a chance to get out, you're not really going to say anything, no big deal. You might just think them a little bit rude because that's more of a folkway, right? A norm. But a more or a taboo means that it's so much part of the culture that we require conformity from other people. So when other people don't conform, they're breaking a core value, or we may consider it to be an extreme taboo. We can remove them from the society, which is a negative sanction. You're going to have an extreme negative sanction. If people follow the mores and taboos or folkways, they get positive sanctions. So if you smile at somebody, they're likely to smile back at you. That's a positive sanction. If you cut somebody off in line, they're likely to say something to you, tap you on the shoulder, give you a dirty look, any of those things, because they're giving you a negative sanction for breaking a norm or a value. So in our culture, we have a variety of different types of values, and they're usually clustered together. Values are not independent. They don't live in isolation like on an island by themselves, right? They are essentially clustered as groups together. So we think work hard and save your money, right? Rich, beautiful, and thin, right? So we think of those as value clusters. A value contradiction is when you have two or more values in our society that oppose each other. We have all these holidays where you're supposed to eat a lot on Christmas, and you get all this candy on Halloween, and you have a huge meal for Thanksgiving, and then for football season, everybody's watching games and eating wings and nachos and all these fatty foods. So you should eat, but you should be very, very skinny. You might hear somebody say, oh, drink like a man, or you get these kind of like positive sanctions for over drinking in male culture. But if you drink too much, you're a drunk and you'll get negative sanctions. Those are value contradictions in our society. Then we have what we call ideal versus real culture. So our ideal culture is the ideal that we have for our norms, values, and mores in our society. And then our real culture is the actual thing that we do, right? So we can value equality amongst all, but if some groups are treated as different or distinct within policy or law or within the norms of society, that's the real culture. So the ideal culture is equality for all. The real culture is inequality within society. Now, we tend to have what we call cultural lag a lot of times, and this is when all or part of your culture changes, and it doesn't all change at the same time. So we often think, okay, like the young have latched on to a particular value, cultural value, but the old refuse to give up their old particular value. But it doesn't just work that way. So a few examples that work really well in today's day and age are the marriage equality rights built into law, and the marijuana use built into law. So a cultural lag would be explained this way. People were very much against marriage between two people of same sexes, but then after it was passed into law, more and more people became accepting of that as a cultural norm. The same thing is going on today with marijuana. You see many people still against marijuana usage, and see it as a vice and bad for the country and bad for economics and for individuals, but then it is becoming legalized in a variety of states. And as you see it legalized, you see the ideology about it starting to shift, where people are starting to see it more as akin to alcohol consumption, right? But you still have some people who see that as a bad thing. They're still not quite with the idea that it should be legalized. And we do this because of even micro-ethnocentrism, right? So we're using our culture, our time, and our place, and we're evaluating others based on that. So if you come from a time and a place where it was the norm, the value that people of the same sex shouldn't get married and that people should not smoke marijuana, but it's perfectly fine to smoke or to drink alcohol, then when you see that marijuana has become legalized or that same-sex marriages have become legalized, you tend to use your cultural yardstick for evaluating others or those particular values. That's ethnocentrism. If you were to try to attempt to understand that based on the other culture, the newer, the more modern perspective of it in this perspective, or from another country or another state, then you would be attempting cultural relativism. So this is just a few American culture core values that I just like to show you. So you can see how some of these are can be grouped together, and some of these are contradictory to each other, right? So achievement and success, American values, achievement and success versus education, individualism, hard work, efficiency, material comfort, freedom, equality. While we also value education, religiosity, romantic love, leisure. You see how leisure is contrary to hard work, religiosity. Oh, I said that one, right? Self-fulfillment, youthfulness, thinness, group superiority. These are all also American values, right? Which is why we would say that we both believe in equality and freedom, and we believe in group superiority. It's a value contradiction within our society. Okay, so what are norms? What are values? And what are mores? So norms are the expected rules for everyday behavior. Values are the standard by which this society defines as good or bad. And mores are the norms and values that are strictly enforced. How do you enforce those norms? You enforce them through both positive and negative sanctions. A positive sanction is a reward for those norms, whereas a negative sanction is a punishment for breaking those norms. Can you think of a few examples? And here are your discussion study guides. I highly recommend you try to pause this and write down the answers, and then go back and compare your answers now to your answers previously to see what you do know and what you do not know.